They branded him a traitor and left him bleeding in the Alaskan snow, like one more life could be erased with a signature. Jack Moore, a wounded Navy SEAL with nowhere to run, hid in a forgotten cabin where the wind howled louder than his prayers. Then a dying German Shepherd dog crawled to the porch, trembling like a tiny miracle that refused to give up. Jack fed him his last bite and whispered, "No one gets left behind." He thought he'd saved a stray. 3 nights later, 4 black SUVs rolled out of the trees, and a speaker growled, "Hand over the asset." Not the dog, the asset. And Jack realized the truth wasn't lost. It was being hunted, and only faith, courage, and that little pup could lead him home. Snow pressed against the Alaska pines like a cold prayer, and the wind kept answering with teeth. In the cabin's thin walls, every gust sounded like a verdict being read aloud. Jack Moore listened anyway. Jack was 32, built like a man forged in salt water and discipline, broad-shouldered with the dense strength of someone who carried gear for miles without complaint. His face had the hard geometry of service, a squared jaw with faint stubble, a healed cut splitting one eyebrow, and eyes the color of storm glass that never fully stopped scanning. People used to joke his gaze could find a lie the way a compass finds north, but it wasn't magic. It was training, and it was what training had done to him. In the teams, Jack had learned to be calm in chaos, to keep his voice low when everything else was screaming, to choose the next correct move even when fear tried to hold the pen. That steadiness came with a cost. He'd grown quiet around people, careful with laughter, as if joy were a resource to ration. Then the mission went bad, and the rationing turned into hunger. The assignment in the mountains had started like any other, a clean brief, a clean map, a clean promise that everyone would come back. But the explosion came wrong, early and hungry, blooming where it shouldn't have, swallowing the night in fire and shrapnel. Jack remembered the shockwave punching his ribs, remembered the way a teammate's shout broke into static, remembered thinking, absurdly, that the snow would put the flames out, because snow always cleaned things. It didn't. Within 24 hours, the world had rewritten him. The paperwork arrived like a priest who no longer believed in mercy. Classified access revoked, communications severed, status suspended, and the accusation stamped in language colder than the weather, a single word dressed up as policy. Traitor. They said he leaked coordinates. They said he cost lives. They didn't ask him to speak. They didn't give him a room to tell the truth in. They gave him a cage and called it procedure. Jack did what a hunted man does when the law becomes a net thrown by the wrong hands. He slipped out, not to outrun justice, but to survive long enough to drag justice into the light and make it look itself in the mirror. So he vanished into neutral wilderness, into a rotting trapper's cabin that smelled of old smoke and wet wood, set back from any road that mattered. The place had one small porch, one stubborn stove, and windows that rattled like loose teeth. Jack's wound rode him like a shadow. A jagged tear along his ribs made every deep breath feel like it was tearing him twice. Sometimes a cough climbed up without permission and left iron on his tongue. He checked the injury the way he checked everything now. Quick, methodical, refusing panic the satisfaction of being seen. He had a roll of gauze, 2 antiseptic wipes, and the kind of pain you can't fully medicate. Food was worse. A few dented cans, a couple protein bars, some jerky that tasted like old patience. He became a machine with a heartbeat, living by a routine that kept him from thinking too long. Chop wood, reset traps, melt snow, boil water, inventory every sound, sleep with one eye open, the other eye dreaming of radios that wouldn't answer. In the silence, the betrayal grew its own weather system inside him. It wasn't the accusation alone. It was who had signed off on it, the invisible hands that had guided the narrative like puppeteers hiding behind flags. Jack had loved the uniform the way some men love scripture, not because it was flawless, but because it meant something larger than himself. Now that same symbol felt like it had turned its face away. He caught himself replaying the moment he'd been handed the suspension order, the polite distance in the messenger's posture, the practiced neutrality, the way official language can sound so reasonable while it buries you alive. At night, the cabin offered no comfort, only a narrower arena for his thoughts to fight in. He'd lie on the thin mattress, one hand near his knife, and try to remember the last time he slept without bracing for impact. Sometimes he would picture the ocean, not for romance, but for steadiness. That endless breathing body that never pretends it can't swallow a storm. He told himself he wasn't afraid. He told himself he was patient. He told himself truth was a stubborn thing, like a seed that can crack rock if you give it time. But the longer he stayed out here, the more time felt like a blade that could cut both ways. On the 17th night, the wind calmed just enough for the world to sound sharper. Jack was half asleep when something shifted outside, a soft scrape under the porch steps, then another, deliberate, searching. Not a branch. Not the casual scuttle of a mouse. It moved with intention, like a hand feeling for a lock. Jack's eyes opened fully, storm glass alert, and in the cabin's thin darkness, he realized the wilderness wasn't the only thing that could find him. The night had a clean, surgical cold, the kind that made sound carry as if the air itself were glass. Jack moved before thought finished forming, rolling off the mattress and letting training take the wheel. Knife in hand, he crossed the cabin without lighting the lamp, shoulders low, breath measured to keep the cough trapped. The scraping came again, patient and close, right under the porch steps, like something testing boundaries. He eased the bolt back, opened the door a finger's width, and the wind slipped in with a predator's curiosity. Then he saw it. A German Shepherd pup, no more than 8 or 9 weeks old, crouched under the lowest step like a dropped bundle of shadow. Its coat was the classic black and tan, but the tan was drowned in mud, and the black was dull with frost. One eye was swollen shut, the other a wary amber that flickered between defiance and surrender. Its ribs showed through the fur in thin, honest lines. A hind leg dragged at an angle that made Jack's stomach tighten, not from squeamishness, but from recognition. The pup tried to snarl, tiny teeth flashing, but what came out was a broken, breathy sound that didn't threaten so much as apologize for existing. Jack's first instinct was distance. The world was full of bait, full of traps shaped like mercy. He'd learned that in combat, and he'd learned it again in a conference room where someone he respected had looked through him like he was already gone. But the pup shivered hard enough that its whole body trembled, and Jack's chest pinched in a different way. The animal wasn't performing. It was failing. He stepped out into the snow, boots sinking with a soft crunch, and knelt at the edge of the porch. "Easy," he murmured, voice low the way you speak to skittish civilians and frightened recruits. The pup's ears flattened. It snapped once, more reflex than intention, and Jack noticed the torn edge of one ear, the dried blood crusted there, the small tremor in its jaw from cold and pain. He could have shut the door. He could have done the math. Food scarcity, injury, exposure risk, unknown variables. That was the soldier's mind. But the man who still believed in leave no one behind looked at that pup and saw a smaller version of himself shoved out of the pack and expected to disappear. Jack exhaled, slow, and made a decision that felt like stepping onto thin ice. He reached into his jacket and pulled out the last clean strip of gauze. He tore it in half because even mercy had to be rationed, and offered his palm. The pup's nose twitched. Its breath was sour with hunger. It didn't move closer, but it didn't retreat either. Jack slid his other hand under the pup's chest and felt bones too sharp for something meant to be young. The pup flinched, then went still, as if stunned by the idea of being held without harm. Jack carried it inside, the way he'd carried wounded men out of bad terrain, careful and firm, refusing to let his hands shake. Warmth from the stove hit them both. The pup's body quivered harder as it thawed, a cruel little trick of biology. Jack set it near the fire, then stripped his scarf off and draped it around the pup like a blanket. In the lamplight, the animal looked even smaller, its paws oversized and clumsy, as if it had been born to grow into something strong but hadn't been given the time. Jack cleaned the swollen eye with boiled water, cooled in a cup, then examined the leg. The joint wasn't right. He didn't have x-rays, but he had enough field medicine to know pain when he saw it. He fashioned a splint with 2 straight sticks from the woodpile and strips torn from an old flannel shirt. His fingers moved with the calm precision of someone who had taped up worse injuries in worse places. The pup whined once, sharp, then pressed its muzzle against Jack's wrist as if anchoring itself. Jack froze at that contact. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was trust being offered before it had any reason to exist. He opened a can of stew and spooned half into a bowl, pushing it toward the pup. "You eat," he said, and surprised himself with the softness in his own voice. The pup devoured it, fast and messy, then looked up like it was bracing to be punished for taking too much. Jack slid the bowl back toward it. Again. When the pup finished, it tried to stand, failed, and settled down with a small huff that sounded almost offended by its own weakness. Jack sat on the floor across from it, back against the wall, and watched the rise and fall of its breathing, like he was counting something sacred. "What are you doing out here?" he asked, though the pup couldn't answer. In his mind, he pictured hands letting it go, a truck door slamming, the animal left to figure out survival with a broken leg, and no map. He understood that kind of abandonment too well. "You need a name," Jack said finally. The pup's good eye tracked him, alert despite exhaustion. It wasn't friendly, not yet, but it was paying attention, absorbing. Jack noticed how the pup's gaze kept flicking to the windows, to the door, to corners, as if it was scanning, like a little sentry trapped in a small body. "Scout," Jack decided, "because you're watching everything." The pup blinked once, slow, and rested its chin on its paws, listening like it might remember the sound of that name, even if it didn't trust the man saying it. The days that followed were not gentle. Jack still had to trap rabbits and melt snow and keep the chimney from choking them both. He worked through pain, coughing into his elbow to keep Scout from flinching. Scout shadowed him on 3 legs, stubborn as a bruise, learning the cabin's angles and Jack's moods. When Jack's breath hitched and his hand pressed his ribs, Scout would nose his thigh and sit close, as if proximity could stitch a body back together. When the wind rose at night and the cabin creaked, Scout would lift its head and stare at the door until the sound passed, guarding without being asked. Jack caught himself talking to Scout the way he used to talk to his teammates in a quiet stack before a breach. "We hold, we breathe, we don't panic." One afternoon, Scout dragged a torn leather glove from under the porch, tail wagging like it had conquered a dragon. Jack laughed, a short sound that startled him with its own existence. He hadn't heard himself laugh in weeks. Scout froze, then wagged harder, pleased by the noise as if it was a medal. That night, as Jack tightened the splint and checked Scout's eye, he noticed the pup's gaze angle again, the same direction toward the tree line beyond the frozen creek. It didn't bark. It didn't whine. It just stared, rigid and intent, as if a memory lived out there in the dark and refused to be forgotten, as if it had been sent, as if it had chosen him, or been chosen for him. On the 7th night after Scout's arrival, the pup suddenly lurched off its bedding, limped to the back door, and scratched once. Urgent. Jack grabbed his coat and followed, the snow biting his cheeks. Scout led him, pulling toward a stand of spruce where the wind formed drifts like frozen waves. Then it began to dig, frantic, pawing snow aside until something dark and metallic surfaced. Jack's breath caught. Half buried beneath ice was a scorched piece of equipment, its edges blackened, its surface stamped with a familiar set of numbers. Not just any numbers, his unit's designation. Morning came pale and bloodless, as if the sun itself had been interrogated and decided not to testify. The wind had died, leaving the woods unnaturally still, and that stillness made Jack more uneasy in the way only a trained man can be uneasy. Not emotional, not dramatic, just an internal alarm clock ticking 1 second too loud. Scout was already awake, nose pressed to the crack beneath the door, ears angled forward like antennae. The pup had gained weight in the week since it stumbled into Jack's life, but what startled Jack wasn't the growth in the body. It was the sharpening of the presence. Scout moved with less puppy clumsiness now, placing paws with careful intent, like it had learned that noise was an invitation for danger. Jack pulled on his gloves and stepped outside with Scout limping beside him, the splint still wrapped but steadier than before. The place Scout had dug the night prior looked like a wound in the snow. Jack knelt and dug with a small camp shovel, the cold biting through leather. Beneath the scorched metal fragment was ice, and beneath the ice was something heavier, sealed in a black polymer case that looked built to survive fire, water, and secrecy. Jack chipped at the ice until the case came loose with a reluctant pop, as if the earth didn't want to give it back. The latch was cracked, the tamper seal torn. A smudged thumbprint stained one corner, and across the lid someone had written in thick black marker, "If you're holding this, they've turned their guns on you." Jack stared at the sentence until it felt like it was staring back. He knew the handwriting, not the exact curve of every letter, but the attitude in it, the bluntness of someone who hated extra words, a teammate, a friend, someone who had either died or learned how to disappear. "Tell me you're not dead," Jack whispered, and the sound came out like a prayer he didn't fully believe in. Scout's nose bumped Jack's sleeve, a quick contact, then the pup turned and faced the tree line, posture rigid, as if it expected something to step out and claim what Jack had unearthed. Back inside, Jack set the case on the table and cleaned his hands as if he were about to perform surgery. That was what this was, in a way, a cut into the body of his ruined life, searching for the infection. He didn't have a laptop, not anymore, not since his access had been ripped away like skin. But the cabin had an old ruggedized tablet he'd scavenged months ago from an abandoned supply shed, a battered thing with a cracked corner, and enough stubbornness to still turn on. He'd kept it for weather maps and emergency radio frequencies, never thinking it would become a witness. He opened the case. Inside was a small military-grade drive, waterproof, shockproof, the kind used when data mattered more than comfort. Jack's pulse slowed, the way it always did right before a breach. Calm wasn't peace. Calm was a weapon. He plugged the drive into the tablet. The screen flickered, then demanded a password. Jack tried the obvious, then the personal, then the bitter. Nothing. Scout sat beside him, unusually still, watching Jack's hands the way a dog watches a door handle, as if it understood that everything hinged on the next small movement. Jack took a breath and tried something he hadn't tried in a long time, trust his intuition instead of his orders. He typed the nickname only his team used for him. A call sign said, half as insult, half as affection, because Jack never missed a detail and never let a man fall behind. The drive opened. Jack felt his stomach drop. He scrolled through folders labeled with codes and dates. One file stood out, not because it screamed, but because it didn't. A single video. No label, no flourish. Just a timestamp. He tapped play. The footage was shaky, recorded from a pocket angle, probably a body cam hidden under a shirt. It showed a conference room with a glass table reflecting overhead lights like a sterile halo. Several men sat around it, most in suits, one in a uniform. Then a voice spoke, and Jack's blood turned to ice. Commander Grant Harlow. Harlow wasn't just an officer. He was the kind of man people followed without asking why. Mid-40s, always clean-shaven, hair cut tight, eyes pale and unreadable. He wore authority like a tailored coat. He had once put a hand on Jack's shoulder after a brutal operation and said, "Good work, son." And Jack had felt, for a moment, like he belonged to something unbreakable. In the video, Harlow's voice was even, measured, as if he were ordering coffee. "We have a leak," he said. "We need a narrative that closes the door." Someone asked, nervous, "What about the team?" Harlow didn't hesitate. "Control the witnesses. Clean it up." Another man slid a folder across the table. Jack caught the glimpse of numbers, routing information, a bank transfer to an account with no name. A third voice, rougher, said, "Coordinates for the mountain OP can be shifted last minute. Blame the operator who survives." Harlow's reply was quiet and final. "Make sure he's the only one who survives." Jack's hands went numb. The tablet felt suddenly heavier, like it was made of guilt. He watched again, forcing himself to notice details. A signet ring on one man's hand, a scar on another's knuckle, the corner of a logo on a folder that looked like a private security firm, not military. He paused the video on Harlow's profile and felt something break inside him, not loudly, but cleanly, like a bone snapping. It wasn't just betrayal. It was the realization that the man Jack had trusted as a father figure had been the architect of his exile. The soldier in Jack wanted immediate action. The man in Jack wanted to sit down and let grief take its seat. He did neither. He copied the video and the files he could identify onto a tiny micro SD card, the kind you could hide under a tongue if you had to. He wrapped it in plastic, then in tape, then in more tape, building a small fortress for truth. Scout stood up, hackles lifting, a low rumble in its chest. Jack looked up. The pup wasn't staring at the tree line now. It was staring at the narrow trail that led to the cabin, ears sharp, body angled between Jack and the window like a living shield. "What is it?" Jack murmured, and as if the world wanted to answer him with a fist, he heard it. The crunch of tires on packed snow. One vehicle, then another. The sound was wrong out here, too deliberate, too heavy. Jack's eyes snapped to the window. Through the frost-streaked glass, black shapes moved between the trees. Headlights cut across the clearing. 4 SUVs rolled in, matte black, tinted windows, reinforced bumpers, the kind of cars that didn't belong to hikers or hunters. Jack's throat tightened. He hadn't even had time to hide the tablet, to bury the card, to plan. A speaker crackled to life outside, and a voice came through, amplified, bored, deadly. "Jack Moore," it said, pronouncing his name like a target. "Hand over the asset. You have 10 seconds." The clearing brightened with headlights that didn't feel like light at all, more like a knife laid flat across the snow. Jack Moore didn't waste breath cursing. He tucked the microSD card into the seam of his boot, where the leather met the sole, a hiding place chosen by habit and desperation, then slid the tablet under a loose floorboard beside the stove. Scout stood with its body angled between Jack and the window, fur bristling, a low warning rumbling from a chest too small to sound that certain. The voice outside repeated itself, calm as paperwork. "Hand over the asset." Jack's mind moved fast, not frantic. He counted. 4 vehicles, likely 4 operators in each if they were serious. but the way the SUVs parked said something. They didn't expect a fight. They expected compliance, or smoke. He flicked off the lamp, letting the cabin swallow itself into shadow, and crouched near the window's edge, peering through a slit in the curtain. The doors of the SUVs opened in near-perfect timing. 4 men stepped out, one from each vehicle, as if they were the heads of the spear and the rest of the bodies were still waiting inside. They weren't hunters, not in the way Alaska makes hunters. No wool, no weathered faces, no slouch of people who've made peace with mud. These men wore black field jackets and tactical gloves, throat mics clipped high, earpieces snug, their movements economical and rehearsed. Even at a distance, Jack could read the difference between fear and training. They were not afraid of the woods. They were afraid of failing orders. The leader moved to the center of the clearing with a slow confidence that came from power being granted, not earned. He was tall, maybe 6'2", lean in the way a blade is lean, with close-cropped hair and a jawline so sharp it seemed designed for propaganda posters. A pale scar tracked from his cheekbone toward his ear, not disfiguring but declaring, this man had been in violence and decided it suited him. He lifted a hand, and the others paused like trained dogs. His voice carried when he spoke again, not through the speaker this time, but directly, a sound of controlled contempt. More. Don't make this messy. Jack's ribs flared with pain as he shifted position, but he held still. Scout gave a small, furious snort, a puppy's version of outrage. The leader's gaze swept the cabin, then dipped as if he could see through wood. We know you found it, he said. We know you copied it. We also know you're running out of food, out of medicine, and out of options. He smiled slightly, the kind of smile you'd see on a man who could order coffee and casualties with the same tone. Bring the dog out. Then we'll talk about you. The word dog landed like an insult. Asset had been worse, but dog felt like erasure. Jack glanced at Scout and saw the pup's good eye fixed on the leader, unblinking, as if memorizing him for later. You're not taking him, Jack whispered, and the sentence surprised him with its certainty. It wasn't just about the pup. It was about the principle that kept Jack alive. Some lines are worth dying behind. He slipped toward the back of the cabin, guiding Scout with 2 fingers in a silent hand signal. Scout, startlingly, understood. The pup limped after him, quiet as breath, tail low but not tucked, pride intact, even in pain. Jack had prepared the cabin weeks ago in case bears came too close. He'd never planned for men. But survival doesn't care what you planned. It cares what you built. A thin tripline ran outside the front porch, anchored to a bent sapling and a rusted bell. Jack had moved it so wind wouldn't trigger it. Now he tightened it. Another trap. A bag of ash from the stove perched above the front door's interior frame. Crude, but effective. Not lethal, just blinding. He didn't want to kill anyone if he could avoid it. Killing would become the story they wanted. He wanted to live long enough to tell the real one. A boot crunched onto the porch. The cabin door shuddered under a heavy knock that was half warning, half amusement. Last chance, the leader called. Jack's jaw clenched. He waited until the next knock, then yanked the front door open and kicked it wide with his good leg. The ash bag dropped. A gray cloud exploded outward, sucking the porch into choking dust. A man coughed, swore, stumbled. Jack moved through the smoke like a ghost with a heartbeat, grabbing the coughing operator by the jacket, wrenching him sideways and slamming him into the railing hard enough to make him fold. Jack didn't linger. He darted back inside, shoved the door shut, and dragged the couch across it. Outside, voices sharpened, annoyed now, adrenaline rising. The bell on the tripline jingled once. Another figure had crossed it. That sapling snapped forward, and the line lashed a shin. A curse, then a thud in the snow. Jack heard the sound of a suppressed weapon being readied, a soft mechanical click, intimate and deadly. He pressed Scout behind the pantry door. "Stay," he mouthed. Scout didn't stay. The pup stepped forward, placing itself beside Jack, as if refusing to be ordered into helplessness. Jack's throat tightened. He could command men. He couldn't command love. The leader's voice came again, closer. "Cute," he said. "You're playing hero. But this isn't a rescue story, Moore. This is cleanup." The word cleanup sliced deeper than traitor. It meant they weren't here to arrest. They were here to erase. The back window shattered inward with a muted crack. Something small clinked onto the floor and rolled. Jack's eyes caught it instantly. A smoke canister, modified, military issue. The cabin began to fill with thick gray fog, swallowing air, swallowing visibility, swallowing time. Jack grabbed a wet cloth and pressed it to Scout's muzzle, then to his own. He coughed anyway, ribs screaming. Through the fog, he saw the leader's silhouette at the front, steady, patient, waiting for panic to do the work. Jack's mind made a cold calculation. If they wanted the asset, they wanted Scout alive, at least for a minute. That minute was Jack's only window. Then a new smell punched through the smoke. Gasoline. A man outside laughed once, short and ugly. "Burn it," someone said. Jack's stomach dropped. The cabin wasn't just shelter. It was the first place in weeks where Jack had let himself believe he might outlast the lie. He looked at Scout. The pup looked back, amber eye bright with fear and stubborn loyalty. Jack thought of the video, of Harlow's voice, of the line he'd lived by in the teams. No one left behind. He made the decision that hurt like pulling a nail from bone. "We go," he whispered, and grabbed Scout up against his chest. The pup yelped once as its injured leg bumped Jack's arm, then clung, trusting. Jack kicked open the back door and burst into the white. Snow hit his face like thrown salt. He ran downhill, using the slope, cutting between trees, shoulders clipping branches, lungs burning. Behind him, the cabin coughed smoke into the sky. Then the sound came, not a clean bang, but a deep concussion that shoved the world. The cabin erupted, fire blooming in a furious orange flower against the endless black-green of pines. Heat rolled across the clearing. The explosion painted the snow with shadows that danced like demons. Scout let out a raw, high sound, not quite a bark, not quite a howl, more like a vow being forced out of a small throat. Jack stumbled, turned his head, and saw the flames reflected in Scout's single good eye, like a tiny inferno trapped behind glass. In that reflection, something else flashed. The pup's collar, half hidden by fur and soot, had a metal tag stamped with a symbol Jack recognized with sick clarity, a stylized wolf head inside a shield. The exact logo of Vanguard Ridge Solutions, the private security contractor that had funded half the clean operations Jack used to protect. Jack's blood ran colder than the snow. Scout wasn't just a stray. Scout was connected, branded, owned. And that meant the people hunting them weren't improvising. They were retrieving property. Seattle wore winter like a tailored suit, all sharp glass and bright lies, the city lights glittering on wet streets as if nothing ugly ever happened under them. Jack Moore moved through that glow like a man who didn't belong to daylight anymore. His face was gaunter from hunger and sleepless miles, but the bones of him were still unbroken. Shoulders set, eyes steady, jaw tight with purpose. Scout trotted close at his heel, bigger now than any 8-week pup had a right to be, still limping but stubbornly upright, the black and tan coat cleaner after days on the run. The pup's collar tag had been pried off and shoved into Jack's pocket, but the faint imprint it left in the leather was a bruise you could feel with your thumb. Jack didn't come to the city to beg. He came to stab the lie in the heart and force it to scream in public. Vanguard Ridge Solutions Gala took place in the Obsidian Atrium, a high-ceilinged hall of black marble and chandeliers that looked like frozen fireworks. Outside, a red carpet stretched like a tongue, licking the shoes of senators, generals, and donors whose smiles were polished and empty. Cameras flashed. Reporters murmured. Security moved with that smooth arrogance that comes from believing the rules are theirs to bend. Jack stayed across the street in the shadow of a parking structure, watching the entrance like it was a compound. The micro SD card sat taped under his belt buckle, close enough to his heartbeat to feel honest. Scout's amber eye tracked the doors, then flicked up to Jack's face as if asking whether they were really doing this. Jack crouched and pressed his forehead briefly to Scout's. "In and out," he whispered. "No heroics." Scout exhaled warm breath against Jack's cheek, and Jack felt a strange, bitter humor rise. He'd said the same thing to men before they walked into gunfire. They moved. Jack kept to the edges, slipping between valet lines and decorative hedges. He expected Scout to hesitate at the noise, the crowds, the hard pavement after so much snow. Instead, the pup pulled forward with uncanny certainty, nose high, ears pointed, body angled toward a side service corridor that wasn't on the bright brochure. Scout stopped at an unmarked door, then pawed once, sharp and decisive. Jack's stomach tightened. "How do you know that door?" he murmured. Scout didn't answer, of course, but the way it stared at the handle felt like memory. A security guard stepped into the corridor, young, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and the nervous energy of someone who still believed in rules. His name tag read, Lucas Reed. He looked at Jack's worn coat, then at Scout, and his hand drifted toward his radio. Jack lifted both palms slowly, the universal gesture of, "I'm not your problem," while his eyes studied the man's posture, the slight tremor, the conflict behind his gaze. "You don't want to do this," Lucas said, voice low. He was trying to sound firm, but his eyes kept flicking to Scout's injured leg, compassion leaking through professionalism. Jack chose truth, because lies were already killing him. "They framed me," Jack said, "and that company inside paid for it." Lucas's jaw worked, as if grinding doubt into something he could swallow. "You're Jack Moore," he whispered, recognition landing like a weight. "They said you went rogue." Jack almost laughed. "I did," he said, "rogue for the truth." Scout stepped forward and nudged Lucas's boot, not begging, just acknowledging. Lucas's breath hitched. Something softened in him. Maybe he had a dog at home. Maybe he'd had a brother in uniform. Maybe he was simply tired of being a gate for people who treated humans like paperwork. 3 minutes, Lucas murmured, stepping aside. "If cameras catch you, I never saw you." Jack didn't thank him with words. He nodded once, the way soldiers do when gratitude is too heavy for speech. Scout led Jack through the service corridor into a network of back hallways that smelled like catering steam and expensive cologne. The pup turned left, then right, then stopped at a staircase that rose behind the stage. Jack's skin prickled. Scout wasn't guessing. Scout was navigating, as if those hallways had once held its paw prints when it was still labeled property. At the top of the stairs, the ballroom opened like a jeweled mouth. 1,000 people faced a stage where a massive screen glowed behind a podium. On that podium stood Commander Grant Harlow, immaculate as ever, his suit dark, his hair cropped, his smile practiced for donors. He looked older than Jack remembered, but not softer. A man like Harlow didn't soften. He sharpened. "Tonight," Harlow was saying, voice smooth as oil, "we celebrate clean operations, precision, accountability." Jack felt heat crawl up his neck. Accountability. The word tasted like poison. He stepped out from the shadows. Gasps rippled through the room like a dropped tray of crystal. Someone shouted. A camera turned. Harlow's smile twitched, then steadied, the way a mask steadies when it senses danger. Jack walked straight toward the front, Scout beside him, limping but proud, head high as if daring the room to call it an asset again. "Jack," Harlow said warmly, too warmly, like a father welcoming a wayward son home. "This isn't the place." Jack's voice came out calm, lethal in its restraint. "It's exactly the place." He pulled a small adapter from his pocket, the kind used for presentations, and plugged the microSD into the side console beneath the screen. For 1 second, nothing happened. Then the screen flickered. The ballroom's music died, as if someone had cut its throat. The video began. Harlow's own voice filled the hall, clear and undeniable. "Control the witnesses. Clean it up." The donors' faces tightened. A senator's wife covered her mouth. Reporters surged forward, phones raised, the scent of scandal intoxicating them like blood in water. Harlow's expression froze in the smallest crack of panic. Then he lifted his hands. "Deepfake," he said quickly. "Fabrication." Jack held his gaze. "You taught me to watch for details," Jack replied. "So watch this." He advanced the clip, pausing on the signet ring, the bank transfer, the folder logo. Vanguard Ridge Solutions. The room began to roar, not with violence, but with realization. That collective gasp a crowd makes when it understands it has been lied to in a tailored suit. That was when the cleanup crew moved. 2 men in black suits, earpieces glinting, pushed through the side aisle. Their eyes weren't on the screen. Their eyes were on Jack. One hand dipped toward a concealed weapon. Jack's body reacted on reflex, weight shifting, muscles coiling. He could end them. He could turn the gala into a battlefield and become, instantly, the story they wanted again. Unstable, dangerous, guilty by optics. He hesitated for a fraction of a heartbeat, and in that heartbeat, Scout acted. The pup lunged not at a throat, not at a hand, but at the thick power cable feeding the stage system. Teeth sank in. A sharp snap. The lights blinked out. The screen stuttered, then the building's emergency protocols kicked in with a cold mechanical voice. Doors locked. Red exit lights flared. Cameras mounted in the ceiling rotated and turned on, broadcasting automatically to the venue's public safety feed. Harlow's face appeared on a dozen backup monitors, washed in ugly red light, his composure collapsing like wet paper. The cleanup men froze, suddenly aware they were being filmed by a system they couldn't intimidate. Security swarmed, not the private kind, but uniformed city officers, whose radios crackled with "active incident" and "lockdown." Jack raised his hands as they reached him. He didn't run. Not now. Scout stood between Jack and the chaos, chest out, growling low, as if guarding the one human who had finally called it family. A female officer approached, mid-30s, Latina, hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes sharp and tired in the way of someone who'd seen too many men lie. Her badge read, DET. Maya Hernandez. She assessed the room in a single sweep, then looked at Jack, then at the frozen video still playing in fragments on a backup monitor. "Jack Moore?" she asked. Jack nodded. "I can prove it," he said. "It's all here." Maya's gaze dropped to Scout's limp, then back to Jack's face. Something in her expression shifted from suspicion to grim recognition. "You already did," she said quietly, and nodded to her officers. "Take everyone's names. Secure every device. Nobody leaves." Harlow tried to speak, tried to reclaim the room with authority, but his voice was drowned by the sound of people realizing power can bleed. Jack was cuffed, yes, but the cuffs felt different this time. Not a cage, a procedure on camera, under laws that couldn't be whispered away. As he was let out, Scout trotted beside him until an officer gently blocked the path. Jack's chest tightened. "He stays with me," Jack said, the old command tone rising. Maya held up a hand. "He's injured," she said, softer now. "We'll get him care, and when this is over, you'll get him back." Jack swallowed, then nodded once, trusting, because Scout had taught him that trust could be offered again without making you weak. Months later, the investigation cracked open like ice under spring. Harlow's testimony fell apart. Vanguard Ridge's contracts were raided, accounts frozen, files seized. Jack's name was cleared in the same public channels that had condemned him. The apology letter arrived with official signatures, but the thing that mattered more came in a plain envelope: reinstatement of honor and compensation that tasted like guilt money. Jack used it anyway. He bought a small building near the waterfront and turned it into a training and rescue center for retired working dogs and discarded canines, the ones labeled inconvenient when their bodies wore down. He called it Second Watch. Scout recovered, leg healing into a proud, imperfect gait, and took to the center like it had been born to guard the forgotten. On opening day, Jack stood with one hand on Scout's head and watched a line of seniors from the neighborhood come to volunteer, women with soft hands and strong eyes, men with canes and old courage, all of them smiling at the idea that broken things could still have purpose. Jack breathed in the ocean air and felt something in him finally unclench. Honor hadn't died in the snow. It had waited, quietly, for someone stubborn enough to name it out loud. Sometimes God doesn't send a miracle wrapped in lightning. Sometimes he sends it on 4 paws, trembling under a porch step, asking for warmth with the last bit of strength it has left. Jack Moore thought he was saving a dying pup, but in God's quiet arithmetic, that small act of mercy became a doorway back to truth, back to purpose, back to life. If you're watching this with your own wounds, the kind nobody sees, the kind that makes you feel erased, remember this: the Lord specializes in restoration. He can use one ordinary choice, one faithful yes, one meal shared, one hand extended, to reroute an entire future. In everyday life, that might look like checking on a neighbor, forgiving someone who doesn't deserve it, adopting the animal no one wants, or simply choosing to keep going when your heart feels heavy. Your kindness may be the miracle someone else has been praying for, and your endurance may be the testimony you don't even realize you're writing. If this story touched you, please share it with someone who needs hope today. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Have you ever experienced a small miracle that changed everything? And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next story. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and fill your days with peace. In Jesus' name, amen.